Hello, everybody. Hello. We're going to be very, very Swiss today, and we're going to start on time and welcome you to this AI inequality community, climate change, AI, and gender panel discussion, which will explore the intersections of ecofeminism, technology ecosystems, the environment, and our collective future. I'm Caitlin Kraft-Buckman from Women at the Table and the AI Inequality Initiative. And I'm here with a wonderful global lineup of speakers in alphabetical order and counterclockwise around the globe. Modestha Daño, the Asia Director of the Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration, the ETC Group. Constanza Gómez Mont, the leader of Sea Mines and Action Tank in Latin America. And Modestha Mensah, a PhD candidate at the University of Ghana, specializing in African socio-political philosophy, ethics, and critical thinking. And we're super excited to dive into this important discussion, and we'll introduce each panelist at length before they speak. But before I begin, so that we have the same point of departure for the conversation, here's the landscape on gender and climate change laid out by the IPCC, which you know is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their panel of experts in their most recent report. So the key messages are gender and other social inequities, meaning racial, ethnic, age, income, geographic location, compound vulnerability to climate change impacts. They say this with high confidence. Addressing inequities in access to resources, assets, and services, as well as participation in decision-making and leadership, is essential to achieving gender and climate justice, high confidence. Intentional long-term policy and program measures and investments to support shifts in social rules, norms, and behaviors are essential to address structural inequalities and support an enabling environment for marginalized groups to effectively adapt to climate change, very high confidence. Climate adaptation actions are grounded in local realities. So understanding links to Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality is important to ensure that adaptive actions do not worsen existing gender and other inequities within society, meaning that they lead to maladaptation practices, high confidence. Adaptation actions do not automatically have positive outcomes for gender equality, and understanding the positive and negative links of adaptation actions with gender equality goals are important to ensure that adaptive actions do not exacerbate existing gender-based and other social inequalities. And efforts are needed to change unequal power dynamics and to foster inclusive decision-making for climate adaptation to have a positive impact for gender equality, high confidence. And finally, there are very few examples of successful integration of gender and other social inequities in climate policies to address climate change vulnerabilities and questions of social justice. And this, they say, with very high confidence. So, but that is a landscape from a panel of scientists not sitting in this room or around this sort of virtual table. I'm thrilled to open up the conversation. And I will begin with Constanza Gómez Mont, a strategist and social entrepreneur who focuses on harnessing the potential of emerging technologies and models of collective intelligence to amplify social and environmental impact. For the past 17 years, she's led pioneering initiatives through Sea Mines, an action tank in Latin America that she founded, which develops frameworks and policies for inclusive, ethical, human rights-centered technologies, implements tech for good initiatives, and strengthens female leadership in tech and policy fields. She's also founder of the award-winning global initiative AI for Climate, and the founder and director of NaturaTech LAC, a new regional initiative co-founded with the IDB Lab that harnesses new tech to accelerate climate and biodiversity conservation action in Latin America and the Caribbean. So for that impressive resume, we're so happy for you to be with us, Constanza. And just as an opening is, you speak of collective intelligence often in your work. So when you're thinking, what does that mean when you're thinking about emerging technologies in the environment?
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. It's beautiful to be here with you today talking about such important topics. So Basically, for us at Sea Minds and NaturaTech LAC, it comes down to the question of how do you ensure that this decision making and the design of projects that are for us tech driven, especially with AI, what does it mean to be inclusive by heart? So for us specifically, it has meant two things. The first is enabling these mechanisms where all of our projects are multi-sector from the start. So all of our projects bring together to design the project people from the academia, from the government, from international organizations, from big techs when applicable, and most importantly, with our local partners. So basically, we see where, for example, in Mexico, in Yucatan, we're working with AI for jaguar conservation. And again, it's not the question, not necessarily goes, how can we create more efficiencies through AI that would drive certain approaches to the design of the project? Rather, we ask ourselves, how can we bring value through AI and an AI enabled project? And when we focus on value, then we focus necessarily on what is a team of different sectors that can add different values to this equation. That for us, it has been both government and the big techs and everyone to co-design a vision together on how can we enable change. And then when you have this by design, centered in a multi-sector approach with a gender lens that is it's very important to have, the equal representation, and you have female voices seated at the table, then you start to design around the ripples effect on this. And the second very important point for us is not only the multi-sector perspective on this collective action, but also understanding that there's different knowledge systems. And when you integrate different knowledge systems into the project and into the co-visioning, then there's a ripple effect to the projects. For us specifically, that has been the different knowledge system of indigenous peoples, for example, our local partners. So what does it mean when you add, the knowledge and the potential of emerging technologies together with the traditional ecological knowledge of local communities and integrate these two to merge into more profound and more systemic and more collaborative and more collective action driven strategies? It is not only about aggregating information, but rather how do you merge this synergy between knowledge systems, between sectors, between actors, between data that allows for new possibilities to emerge. We're not only doing this, for example, in Mexico through this lens, but also thinking and designing how do we create with this same approach, and with this same approach towards equity, at the middle of collaborative action, towards a Latin American approach. And then how do we change the power dynamics and how do we change, what does a real collaboration rooted in purpose mean? We can delve that into in the next question, of course, but that is core to our work at Sea Minds.
Super. So actually what I'm very fascinated by, so this idea of multidisciplinarity, not being more efficient, but more effective, more values-based, more focusing on knowledge systems, all of these things are sort of totally, we all plus one, everybody's sort of cheering around the table. What are some models that you've witnessed, that you've seen, that you're working with about how this actually gets implemented and makes impact?
Of course. So, for example, I can talk about two very concrete examples. In Colombia, in Nuquí, we're enabling a project together with a beautiful Afro-Colombian community led by Josefina Klinger, who is such a powerful voice from the Afro community. And the question goes, okay, how do we, before starting to design, with a spreadsheet and such, what's the co-vision behind this, this project? So when you put together a group of people that come from, for example, from us, from the tech and collaboration and innovation ecosystem, together with community leaders that have for so many decades, have both the knowledge from traditional and ancestral knowledge, and a very clear vision of what their territory can look like, for this. And then you add, partners from all other sectors, and then each partner brings their best tools to the table. So what we're doing with them, for example, is enabling a tech-driven platform and an action collective platform for the protection of the whale. Nuquí is one of the areas that is called the womb of the Pacific, where the whales go to give birth in this area. So it's not only about, the protection of a very important species, umbrella species such as the whale, but as important are the ripple effects of the community. So how do you create a project that is, yes, AI enabled, but the base and the root is so purposefully designed towards collective action, then the metrics and the vision and the project design goes around not only how can the biodiversity thrive, but also the local community. We're doing the same in Ecuador, we're doing the same in Colombia with some projects that are coming up, and other projects, of course, in Latin America that are rich in culture are enabling new mechanisms of collaboration where both local knowledge systems are being not only respected, but integrated into the core, of technology-driven projects. And most importantly, there is a clear purpose on these collaborations, because sometimes it is very easy to be very simplistic on let's put AI into everything, or let's use, is the blockchain, for traceability. And it's very easy to be very simplistic. The true value in these type of collaborations come when we are very true to the fact that we cannot separate technology from culture, from society, from economy, from biodiversity. And when you think about this as a multi-layer approach, then certainly you think about projects that are more profound, more respectful, and definitely more inclusive.
I would also say more sustainable, probably, too, right? There is no sustainability unless we have this kind of socio-technical approach, and as you say, a multi-layered approach. All right, we're going to do, with that beautiful talking about the womb of the Pacific, we're going to travel across the Pacific to our colleague Neth Daño, Elenita Daño, who's the Asia Director of the Action Group on Erosion, Technology, and Concentration, which is an international civil society organization that monitors impacts of new and emerging technologies on marginalized communities, tracks corporate concentration and governance in food and agriculture, and investigates erosion of biodiversity. She's a researcher who's done in-depth analysis and published work on various issues in agriculture, plant genetic resources, new tech, and climate change in developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, and has represented environmental NGOs at the Climate Technology Center Network, many, including being on a 2-year term appointed by the Secretary General of the UN to the 10-member group that supported the UN Technology Facilitation Mechanism. And she is now, and I'm very, very honored to join her on the Commission for Science and Technology and Development Gender Advisory Board. So, Neth, welcome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for staying up so late in the evening. So you talk about monitoring a lot in your work. So how are you monitoring the impacts of new and emerging technologies on marginalized communities in particular? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the very generous and long introduction. Etc. Group has been working on these issues for the last 40 plus years. And in all these decades up to now, we work closely with social movements, people's organizations, local organizations, in not just in Southeast Asia, but in other parts of Asia as well, and some parts of Latin America. And we do support movements, in particular those who are working in food and agriculture, in their struggles, and trying to understand developments at the global level and how it impacts their lives. And that includes new and emerging technologies. In our work with social movements and people's organizations, we do engage a lot with them through fora, through exposure in their communities. And just recently, just to cite this very concretely, like we held a forum to celebrate the International Day of Women in Davao City, where there were about 200 rural women, mostly from indigenous communities, also urban gardeners and women farmers. And in those discussions, we actually provide information on what's the developments at the global level, and that actually instigates discussions on how this new technologies, for example, digitalization, Also, AI are currently impacting people's lives, and very interesting insights coming from women who actually say that while we are discussing food, agricultural digitalization, there are actually a lot of indigenous women who continue to contribute to food production, not just at the local level, but at the national level, but don't have access to the most basic of all technologies, energy, for example. So we talk about AI, we talk about digitalization, and women are discussing how their lives are actually being is about struggling as they grapple with the reality that they don't have access to electricity and don't have even money to buy the tools, no, that you need for to be able to be integrated in agricultural digitalization, in particular using platforms, using apps, and linking consumers with producers. The tools are not there, are not available. Also, you don't have connectivity and all that. So this is a very concrete discussion, a concrete example of how we actually connect, like how we relate these global developments in the current realities of women, and getting this feedback on how these are impacting them, those who are able to access this technology, and those who are in the margins. So we actually work this way at ETC by continuous interaction with local communities and people's organizations, and also movements of social movements at the global level. We get to get feedback on concrete realities on the ground and how new and emerging technologies help or affect them. And not just AI, but in other spheres, for example, on synthetic biology, also advanced genetic engineering, which are being deployed at the local level. So we do have this kind of interaction. This is largely how we get feedback on how these new technologies are actually impacting the lives of those in the communities. So, yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of amazing, and that is part of the soup, isn't it? It's the meaningful connectivity. Maybe little bit later, when we have a group discussion, we can talk about how solar, especially if one is located in more sun-drenched regions of the globe, whether solar is actually something that would be helpful just on a little modest level for devices. What access to the devices may mean in terms of smartphones, not smartphones, also access to data, right? So this connectivity, data, devices just all need to be put in place in the jigsaw puzzle before AI can be, or any new technology can really be benefited from and deployed. So I'm really interested to know, Neff, because you're a global citizen, what is there about a either very specific project that you're working with, or something about the Southeast Asian context in particular that you find to be very critical? And then when we go around, we'll try and put all the regions together and try and see if we have our own knowledge system.
Yeah. We actually always say that Southeast Asia has always been an ideal playground for deployment, test run of new technologies. We've seen this in genetic engineering, genetically modified crops. We've seen this as well in digitalization in food and agriculture. And there are several reasons for that. No, the fact that many of these technologies, in particular digitalization, are actually developed, grown, and large scale, deployed in large scale in countries that are so near, which actually makes access to technology, to those kinds of technology, quite cheap, no, compared to others. Like in this case, for example, you're talking of digital tools, digital technologies coming from China, which is a key country that develops, no, the technology, and manufactures and commercializes those technologies. So sensors, drones are actually deployed left and right in many farmlands, in many ecosystems and landscapes across Southeast Asia because they're relatively cheap. Not compared to if you go to other regions like Latin America or Africa, because like in the case of drones, the two biggest producers, XAG, DJI, are actually in China, based in China, and he looks at the countries around China as a very practical playground to test, demonstrate, and deploy their technologies. Also, another factor is there are actually several studies that show that Southeast Asians in general are open to new technologies. Like I could probably give you some links to that. They were far more open to introduction of new technologies than say, for example, other Asians to the west or South Asia, for example. So it could be because of this exposure that we have, so proximity to the developers of technology and also industries that are linked to those technologies. Like, bear in mind that the microchips that that enable a lot of digital tools, for example, are mostly manufactured in this part of the world. Talk about Taiwan, TSMCI as the world's biggest, largest producer of semiconductors. Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia are actually big manufacturers down the chain of microchips, which enable a lot of these technologies. Even if you go to genetic technologies in food and agriculture, like genetically modified crops have been tested, deployed first in Southeast Asia more than anywhere in Asia because of our receptiveness to this new technologies. And in the case of food and agriculture, because you have mainly international agricultural research centers like IRI that are based here. So a lot of governments are also very, very supportive in enabling the deployment of these technologies. I think that makes Southeast Asia unique in terms of the relationship and perception and also response of communities, of people in general, of population in general to new technologies. So one more thing is it's because of those factors we actually are as I started my intervention. We are also a favorite playground, like testing ground. Like it may fail or succeed, but Southeast Asia is always an ideal playground because of all those factors that I mentioned. And that is also for good and bad, and in most cases for bad. Like in the case of genetically modified organism and now digitalization, you have countries like the Philippines that are so supportive, massively deploying, but forgetting that the foundational infrastructures are not there. Like we still have like what about 8% of our population don't have access to electricity. You were talking about solar, renewable energy, but that would also um, involve, of course, cost and support those that in order to sustain and maintain those technologies. Yeah, and I think the geopolitically, a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia are also have this, you know, like relationship um, with China closely and also with the US, both key sources and key developers of this technology. So I think those are things that make this sub-region a key area for studies on how people respond to and also accept or reject new technologies.
Super, super. I think we'll go back to commonalities and this idea of communitarianism and communities. I just that I think are the core a lot of your work collectively, mutually, around our circle table today. We're going to now go over to Africa and Modestha Mensah, who's originally from Ghana and is a PhD candidate at the University of Ghana, where her thesis is on a critical study of personhood and Akan thought, a feminist perspective. And I hope you're going to tell us about Akan thought when we ask you a question. She has her BA in philosophy and MPhil in philosophy from the University of Cape Coast, Ghana, where she's now an assistant lecturer. She specializes in African socio-political philosophy, ethics, and critical thinking, and has research interests in AI ethics, feminist ethics, and feminist reinterpretations of African philosophical thought systems. She's also a research affiliate at the Bonn Sustainable AI Lab at the Institute for Science and Ethics at the University of Bonn in Germany, where she researches the intersections between sustainable AI and feminist African ethics. So Modestha, so happy to have you with us. You speak about African ecofeminism quite a lot in your work. So let's start at the beginning. And can you tell us how you define African ecofeminism?
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited that I'm invited to this panel with very distinguished people. Listening to the profile of all the others made me feel like, okay, am I supposed to be here? Because of all the amazing things that you're doing. I mean,
of course you are. No. Oh my God, are you kidding? Everybody should watch all the videos on her online. You are really a great thinker. And we're so happy with us.
Okay. So I must say that, of course, as my profile clearly indicates, I'm not on the field. I'm more looking at the philosophical, ethical framework of things. So I come as more of a research person than my other panelists who are actually on the field and have more information. So that's just caveat. But in my research, especially in technologies and their influence on environmental issues and stuff. Ecofeminism basically is a framework, right, that uses feminist principles as well as ecological issues to discuss how these two intersect as far as environmental justice is concerned. And so fundamentally what ecofeminism in the African context, of course, is to examine how gender and ecology and social justice are interconnected and how these intersections affect women and marginalized communities in Africa, specifically, because, of course, ecofeminism is a general theoretical framework, but in African ecofeminism, we focus on the African context. So that's the space within which I work. And talking about this space, we realize that there is a huge issue about the influence of technologies, in this case, AI, digitalization, and all such technologies, as far as the African community is concerned, and women especially, largely, are the most impacted by these environmental problems, environmental crises, climate change, etc. And all these are for various reasons. So one of the things that African ecofeminist theory criticizes or looks at is the general mindset, the general belief system that guides most of these activities, which is more of one that prioritizes human interests at the expense of everything else, including the natural environment. So it's more like human superiority, human chauvinism, and we don't care what happens to our environment. And actually what this happens is that it informs the way we relate with our environment, which actually devalues it. So that is one of the core issues that African ecofeminist theories look at. And there are various reasons for this. Scholars have suggested that these are founded in Judeo-Christian interpretations of human superiority, also taken up by classical philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and then, of course, medieval and modern philosophers. So there are reasons for that. And another thing also has to do with how African philosophy generally is marginalized or is sidelined, because most of these ideas and attitudes that inform the way people relate with the environment, the way people interact as far as developing technologies are concerned, It's more of using dominant, exploitative control theories, where fundamentally we are dividing reality into two, where we're looking at white versus blacks, we're looking at men versus women, we're looking at poor versus rich, we're looking at human versus the environment, right? So this idea kind of informs the attitude and the beliefs, and which are actually operationalized in concrete action with the environment. And so ecofeminism in the African context calls attention to these kind of dominant attitudes, which is largely colonialist, patriarchal, exploitative, and how all of these culminate in all the activities that we usually engage ourselves in, especially in the field of technology and artificial intelligence. So that is a major issue. And in that space, we're looking at how these dominant theories influence our relationship with the environment, and how African women, who have usually been identified as the most impacted by every environmental crisis that occurs. Of course, that's not by saying that it's only women that are affected by this. No, generally African people, because we're a marginalized group, because of the historical and colonization and patriarchal and all those influences that shape Africa as a continent, African people generally are the most affected, all right, by any environmental crisis. But the problem also is that even within the African context, the effect is disproportionately spread, where we have women being the most impacted compared to their male counterparts. And it's even worse for rural, poor community women, right? So all these are issues that African ecofeminist talks about, so that the general idea is, if we are able to tackle our mindset, if we're able to tackle the dominant theories that we employ to dominate other human beings within society, to dominate one another, exploit one another, because these are the same ideas that we transfer into our relationship with the environment. So if we're able to tackle these social issues, then we can, in that same instance, apply those solutions to our treatment of the environment. And society will be better. Of course, at least the African continent will be better in that space. So this is another major issue that African ecofeminist talks about. And there are several intersections here, but I'm just hoping that as we move on with the conversation, most of these issues will be more pronounced, but as the discussions progress. So these are the major issues that African ecofeminist theories discuss. And by way of solutions, or by way of what we can actually do, one of the key concerns, one of the key issues that have been raised is researchers, technology developers, whoever is interested in social development, in their development, in their design of technologies and so on, should take some sort of interest in the belief systems. And I'm very happy that the former presenter talked about indigenous knowledge systems and all that. Should take interest in the indigenous beliefs, the values of the people who are most impacted by whatever technology that is being developed. So that by learning about African philosophies, by learning about African epistemologies, African ethical values, indigenous methodologies, then we are more informed, we are better placed to, as the previous speakers have said, to join and create a core vision that is really impactful to all who are supposed to enjoy whatever technology that we are talking about. So that is one major issue that African ecofeminists speak of or talk about or emphasize in their theories. So for now,
no, that's beautiful. Are there some, before we go, because I'm going to have a larger discussion, which I hope everybody's just going to jump into in a minute, about communities and about knowledge systems. And I love the idea of calling them knowledge systems, not indigenous knowledge systems, because they are, do you know what I mean? Immediately when they're indigenous, they become other. It's just that we have to embrace the fact that there's so many different ways of collecting knowledge, and whose, as some of our colleagues have said famously, whose knowledge is it? But are there some invisible intersections on the African continent that you would like to talk about that are critically important?
Yes, there are quite several. But because, of course, this context is environmental related, I will stay within this space. So one of them is that, like I have said, the dominance idea, exploitative ideas, theories that we use in our relationship with one another, in our relationship amongst communities, among countries, among continents, what happens is that women are most disproportionately impacted by these dominance ideas, especially those in the African uh, global south, as they say it, in the African continent. And this is why. So it is mainly because of the general space or general place that has been associated with women of feminine gender in the African space, because it's a patriarchal society where, of course, there's domination of masculine ideas, male superiority over female ones. And so, what we have is that women are the most largest labor in agriculture, for example. So, this resonates very well with the previous speaker. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name, so please forgive me. The previous speakers focus on women in her society and how they're not even benefiting from emerging technologies, right? So they are the bulk of labor in agriculture in Africa. They are the bulk. Why? Because they depend solely on this for their sustenance, and also they depend solely on this for providing food, potable water, energy, and all those for their families. Because this is partly intertwined with the general social roles of these women in society, in African societies. So they are the yeah, Caitlin.
Yeah. So I think it's like 80%, I believe, of the workers in agriculture in
Yeah.
Africa are women.
Okay.
And I think maybe I would like to open this up since we're talking about agriculture and our other colleagues are also working in this way about sort of either community efforts, ways. Nath, you talked about drones. Constanza, you talked about sort of this greater knowledge platform or working with biodiversity. It would be really wonderful if, and I'm going to start with Constanza, if we can be as specific as possible when we have community at the core. What happens? How do some of these programs play out? And if you have some stats on agriculture in your region as well, that would be great, but not necessary. It just is the
Perfect. I'll start with a stat, not necessarily on agriculture, but on biodiversity in Latin America. So one of the, factors that drives our work and our passion, for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean is that it is home to 40% of the world's biodiversity. So when you talk about whatever happens in this region, it doesn't stay in this region. You cannot talk about, biodiversity targets if you don't talk about the role of the Amazon and, the role of, this culture-rich region that has in this equation. You cannot talk about climate change and, achieving the metrics, and the goals for climate change if we're not conscious on a global level and a very local level that biodiversity conservation is, prone to mitigate up to 30% of the needed, CO2 emissions. So for us in the region that we're not necessarily focused in agriculture, but rather in biodiversity conservation and regeneration, that yes, there's agroforestry, which is a part of it. The question has boiled down into how do we transition and to an economy that is regenerative? How do we transition from having extractive, both policies and mindsets that go from data, it's from data, from extracting raw materials, from the forest. How do we rethink, our economy and our paradigms into circularity, into regeneration, into equity, into having, as you say, Caitlin, the community at the core of, the practices. So when you start to shift this mindset, understanding that when you put the community at the core, whichever community, local, indigenous peoples, African communities, Western communities, local communities, and any sort, um, you kind of ask the question of how can technology enable this new realm where nature is at the center and the wellness of the people is at the center. And for that, there's two things I believe that we have seen in this work we have led with our local partners. First is a need to transition the metrics for success on the projects. So, for example, a lot of the Western success metrics, has to do with number of species, and number of vectors, and and there's certain things that are, I believe, and we believe in C-Minds that are more valuable that we have to translate into a new form of metric system because it just doesn't make sense, to be able to measure that, For example, we've learned through our Achuar local partners, from the territory, territory leaders, that the most valuable metric is el buen vivir, or the well-being of the community, and the relationship with Pachamama, or Mother Earth. So when you start to think about this integration with, for example, in our case, our Achuar local partners, you start to rethink, well, what are the metrics of success of the projects that you're designing around? Now, there's a big challenge, and I don't like to say it with a simplistic manner. How do you measure the relationship of people with the Pachamama? How do you put that in a form that, for example, financiers understand? And for example, different knowledge systems of more Western perspectives where we want to measure all of it, in numbers and, sometimes even profit. How can we change, the narrative to understand that narratives that come from the bottom to the top, from local communities to the top, has to, as we say in C-Minds, finance has to trickle down, but knowledge and new metric systems have to trickle up. And for us, it has meant two very concrete things. The first is redefining with our local partners what is success, and then how do we create a metric system around that success that makes sense to different knowledge systems, which is not easy, of course. And second, how do we move, beyond thinking about economic terms only? So, sometimes we're pushing each other to understand, what's the economic benefit of a standing forest, and against the exploitative, mindset of extracting the raw materials for it. So sometimes, we believe that together with the local partners, that the economic factor behind it, it's just a placeholder. It's what we need right now to understand a common language. But the true sense in these type of projects that are tech enabled should be, as we believe, is using technology to enable new forms of value creation and value measurement. So we can transition again to an economy that thinks more about this new paradigm of equity, of interconnectedness, and harmony with nature that is sometimes a merge between these different knowledge systems, as you were saying. And we do have to transit to understand that not everything is short-term profit, but rather value in every sense.
Super. I've taken a lot of notes, totally. And I love this idea that knowledge and metrics have to trickle up from the community, right? That's a really beautiful, beautiful phrase. Okay, we're going to come back to, I have a bunch of questions about that too, but I'm wondering, Neth, how you're looking at this sort of from an ecosystem approach and sort of hardcore examples of what's happening in your neck of the woods.
I think what I will take off from what Constance said on the knowledge and metrics should trickle up. I think I like the term trickle up, and I think that should be the core of discussions when you talk of new technologies and women, especially women in the grassroots, the ones who are left behind, quote unquote, if I may use the 2030 agenda for sustainable development concept of those who are left behind. Like the need to trickle up knowledge and metrics from communities above is something that we should be tackling at the core. And I think that's what the work of ETC is all about. Like we deal mainly with rural communities, those food producers, especially small-scale food producers that feed up to 80% of the world. No, like FAO said that 80% of the world's population are actually dependent, no, on food produced by small-scale producers, including indigenous communities, rural women, fishers, pastoralists, urban gatherers, but they remain invisible. In our research at ETC, it's been very clear that when we established, no, that 70%, at least 70% of the world's population depend on the small scale producers, which FAO said is actually 80%. Yet, no, as I said, they remain invisible. No, the metrics are actually even unclear. No, like whose metrics are we using? When we actually introduce this 70-30, that's 70% of the world's population depend on small-scale producers, there were even academics who actually challenged that. Like, what metrics are you using? So they're actually using the metrics of industrial agriculture rather than using the metrics of food production that actually matters across communities, not just the rural and indigenous communities, but urban areas. Like we've seen this during the pandemic on how problems and shocks, no, like the pandemic could actually affect the flow of goods and food from the production area to the consumption area. So I think like using the metrics of those at the bottom is also a key thing that groups who are represented here should be working on. Like this is especially in the case of Southeast Asia, no, like the population of women who are engaged in agriculture may not be as high as Africa, but FAO data shows that 60 to 80% of the work done in agricultural context actually done by women. Like the population may be like 55% men, but 45% women, but the amount of work is actually resting on the shoulders of women. And yet, when it comes to decision making, especially on what technology to use in production, processing, and post harvest and all that, it's actually not those women who toil in the farm who make decisions. It's actually the men. So it's an issue of when we say introduction and deployment of new and emerging technologies in food and agriculture, who makes decisions, no, on which technologies to use, on whether to adopt drones if they have the means, on whether to adopt digital tools, for example. It's not women who makes those decisions, and yet the toil, the burden rests on women. So I think we have to look at it that way. If we're looking at the issue of AI and new technologies in general with the lens of equality or inequality, I think we have to look at the hard realities on the ground. More women, more toil, more burden on the shoulders of women, and yet the decision does not rest on them. So that's the stark reality, and I think that's the reality that we have to address in terms of unpacking the issue of AI and equality, which is the theme of this discussion. So yeah, just some thoughts on that, and thanks, Constanza, for starting that.
Can I just ask just a follow up about drones? Just a high tech is who is using? You said that it's the playground for experimentation. Who are using the drones then? If women are not deciding,
well,
or is this forced on the women?
Yeah. Yes, right now, like if you look at the use of drones in food and agriculture across Southeast Asia, it's mainly plantations. No, like in the case of like where I live in Davao, in southern Philippines, it's actually the banana plantations that are the main adapters of drones. This is food and agriculture. There are also some pilot cases, pilot testing of drones in seeding and also chemical spraying that are deployed by the government, promoted by the government. This is top down. It's not up. It's not bottom up, definitely. And if you look at the Google, even the pictures, drones Philippines, 9 out of 10 you will actually see men flying drones or testing drones or being curious about drones. Toys for the big boys and all that. So plantations are actually mainly men. So like if you will actually unpack that decision making, you will probably come up with a question on will women as farmers adopt drones like as a tool for them to contribute more to food production on the ground. So the reality now is, yes, the deployment of drone, enabling of drone, but then women is still invisible. It's a mainly men's game.
Right.
Yeah, men's toys.
Yeah. Also, but I don't doubt it for a second, probably exacerbated by the algorithm, which we know also just kind of privileges pictures of men with technology because of the sort of the foundational data set. So it associates men with hardware or sports equipment, women with
Yeah,
kitchens. And so probably
exactly.
even if, although I'm sure that there are less women, rural farmers are using drones, that those pictures probably don't get elevated to a kind of a search, which is that feedback loop.
Yeah, that's right. Like the algorithms are actually mainly fortifying the existing inequalities and also existing patriarchal views on what technology is and the involvement of mainly men in development and use of technologies.
Right. And actually, that tees up very perfectly the question I have for Modestha about this interaction of patriarchy, which I think we can sort of extrapolate to regions even outside of Africa, and patriarchy and technology, and how those two things interact, and maybe how ecofeminism is trying to flatten some of those interactions.
Yes. So let me just add that we've been talking about agriculture, and that's very important. But in our context, the burden or the problems go beyond agriculture. They also affect health, women's health, security, women's increased unpaid labor, because of course they are mostly in charge of caring duties and caring responsibilities, and this is very huge. This is, so I am looking more at, of course we're talking about concrete issues, but these are like real existential problems that are ongoing. And so you see that extraction, you see that um, electronic waste, you see that, well, we can't calculate yet the carbon emissions, but we're told that it's increasing, and calls have been made to calculate how much algorithms or training centers or whatever, how much carbon footprints are actually generated. But the point is, it goes beyond impacts on agriculture, which of course women are the people that work most there in our context. But it's also their health, because they are ingesting these substances. It's affecting reproductive systems. It's affecting the general well-being, of course, disproportionately in comparison to their male counterparts. It's also increasing their unpaid labor, because they're spending more time taking care of the kids, the community, the vulnerable, the sick, and all that. So, but by way of pathways forward, right? What African ecofeminist theories or ideas are talking about is, like has already been said, decision making is not mostly in the hands of women. And of course, it's mostly also up down. And the data set that are used to even develop these technologies to mitigate climate crisis and reduce inequalities are themselves already biased, because there are these inequalities in society already, which these algorithms or these data sets exacerbate or replicate, right? And so in terms of policy, in terms of decision, in terms of how are these conversations even had, you don't have these women participating, you don't have African lower class people participating in this, but they're the ones receiving the burden mostly. So it's the call is to do more community collaborations, right? To do more, yeah. Caitlin, I see you want to say something.
No, I'm just curious about because everybody is working with these ideas of these knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, community knowledge systems. If they're there's knowledge that we can benefit from in each of these regions about how communities are engaged in ways that are participatory, that are inclusive, even if it's just bits and pieces that we could piece together. Because I think that we all have this deep desire to be more inclusive, but it's just that the how is very difficult. So are there traditional ways of inclusion, or there can be new ways of inclusion as well? They can be newly invented that anybody wants to point to as a way to help local communities interact in a way that's meaningful.
For us, I can add there an example. For us, it has been learning. For example, the project we're having with Cuencas Sagradas, that is an alliance of more than 30 different indigenous nations, nationalities, and communities in Ecuador and Peru. So what we've been learning there is that their own governance system has been transitioning into having a very gender balanced approach. So now their decision makings, they're the ones that are having, more women including in their decision making, and now they're the ones actually that selected a woman, Veronica, who's an extraordinary person, from the community, to be the both the voice and the leader of a tech-driven conservation project that we're doing with them. So that has meant two things. The first is for us learning not to impose. I think that sometimes when you come from other, from outside, and working with local partners, there's certain a predisposition to impose, your own governance structures or such. For us, it has been learning not only how their own governance structure works, but also their own priorities. And then how do we create an enabling system that accompanies these decisions and accompanies these new forms of leadership? For us, it has meant Veronica, who has been chosen by them to be the leader of this tech-driven project, to ask ourselves as partners, how can we accompany her leadership? Very strategically on two things. One is, what are the tools that Vero needs, for a peer support learning mechanism where Veronica is teaching other 6 communities that are living around how to leverage new technologies for biodiversity monitoring and to access the new biodiversity credit market. And it's not us, teaching, or, even the vocabulary, the word teaching, is quite, sometimes culturally problematic, and it comes with a I don't know, cultural baggage there. But how do we accompany these new forms of leadership for Veronica to have the necessary tools for her to shine in her peer-to-peer role of enabling new systems and knowledge systems to other communities to learn how to use AI, use IoT, use, blockchain systems to be able to access this new nature markets? And very pragmatically for us, for example, COP16 from biodiversity in Cali is just coming up, in some weeks. For us as partners, it has been asking the questions on how can we create more spaces for people like women in positions of leadership, like Veronica, to have a space of visibility in this international fora. Because sometimes we're lacking as a global community to create meaningful spaces for representation. And that requires funding for people to get there, especially women. That requires creating new spaces and new forms of visibility, and that requires a humble approach of a perhaps global ecosystem to really sit down and co-learn, not necessarily to just want to share, our own type of work and then just kind of impose our philosophies, but rather sometimes we have to transition from having panels to having what I've learned in the deep Amazonian jungle, to having a guayusa, which is this format of a meeting. I don't have time to give details, but it is circular. How you sit down is in a circle, and it's at 4 a.m. in the morning, where the voice that comes out in the pure darkness comes from another thing that is not the rationale mind of quickness and fast paced and results driven. It comes from a space of purpose, of reimagining new futures, of enabling new voices. So learning from these type of governance systems and formats, such as the Wayusa, is as important for this question of new voices and new women in positions of leadership as well.
Completely agree, because we need to change the system. It's not only, as we say, it's great. It's not only adding women and stir, right? It's adding women with progressive, open, new visions of the way that we live that can bring people by. So it's great to have the quantitative, but you need the qualitative. That's a really beautiful thing. And I think that I want to learn about that system. I love the idea of 4 a.m. in the forest. You're going up and down. To Neth or Modestha, do you have examples from your region that you feel comfortable sharing or are relevant about this kind of conversation?
Yeah, thanks again, Constanza, for sharing that. Like we have actually similar community decision-making processes, mechanisms as described, like in the north, for example, in northern Philippines, in the Cordilleras. But then I have to say this, that with a caveat, that in most communities, these are actually largely men. No, I'm happy to hear that it's not like that in some communities in South America, but we also have to recognize that in many indigenous and local communities, even traditional decision making mechanisms are dominated by men or just solely men. And that may be changing in some areas, but in others it's not. So I think that has to be recognized, it has to be addressed, and like mobilizing and empowering women to be able to assert themselves and in changing this male dominated patriarchal decision making processes and mechanisms at the local level need to be addressed. I think the acknowledgement, recognition of the male dominance needs to be increased or raised among women for them to be able to change that. I'm sorry for the delay in the video. I think my internet is not stable right now. So I could share a number, but then as I said, mostly male dominated. But I do agree, that utilizing local and traditional decision making mechanisms that could also empower women in terms of decision making on technological aspects, in production, in processing, and even in political decision making at the local level are things that need to be highlighted and need to be promoted. Also, I think it's also very important that those decision making processes should be able to broaden options to communities, not just technological, because like in many circumstances, like development challenges are not even about being fixed by technological solutions, but some other solutions that could be societal or relationships and even changing the economic processes at the local level. So I think it's important to mention that it's not limited to technological solutions. And lastly, I think those decision-making processes at the community level, addressing technology, should be able to strengthen capacities of communities to assess or evaluate technological options. Like, it's not that you actually drop the technological solution from the top that hey, you need drones, and in reality that's not what they need. Or government comes like with a technological solution that may not even be appropriate at the local level. We have hundreds of examples like that, and we need to learn lessons from those. So yeah, I think that's some points from this part of the world.
Yeah. I'm going to go also, Modestha, for examples from Africa about this local community. I think one of the things that's always very tempting for people is because we do have a climate crisis. They want to solve it, so they want to do things at scale. But the fact of the matter is that there are local solutions that don't necessarily scale, but can be replicated, right? So there's so many lessons to be learned across regions and across communities, but that doesn't mean that that one solution is the solution for everybody. And we have to change that mindset perhaps a little. But please tell us what you see going on in Africa.
I'm not aware of too many of these interventions, but the few that I know of have very little impact on technology development, but at least they influence national policy on, for example, environmental conservation or climate change or agriculture, food production, etc. So some of these interventions include, for example, women activist groups who have influenced AU agenda for, so AU is African Union, agenda for 2063, I think. And their influence is mainly focused, one of the goals is for environmental sustainability and gender equality. And when you have these these women activist groups, what you find is that the leadership of these activist groups consults local women, and there are unions at the local level, right? So for example, women in agriculture, they form local unions to share information, to share ideas on their activities. So what these women activist groups do, who are usually made up of more elite, more formal education, acquired sort of women who have access to high decision-making bodies, right? So the power trickles down. These women activist groups consult these local women unions for ideas on environmental conservation inputs or methodologies or values that can be influencing sustainability on that level. So we have, for example, Women in Environment Network. This is based in Ghana, where I am, and they're doing so much as far as environmental policy and climate change is concerned. And we also have, for example, women leaders in Tanzania and Uganda, and these are actually local women who have elected some key women to lead their groups or their unions to influence national policy, to influence national agenda. And it's also similar. One thing that I am aware that is also similar to what I've heard from previous speakers is how the consultation is done, how the engagement is done, right? So in pure indigenous communities or traditional communities, you find people gathered most of the time under a tree, women under a tree in circular form. Sometimes we also have palaver scenarios where you have somebody bring up a problem, we have judges, and all these are made up of women, right? And they share ideas, they talk about the issues, and these are some ways that have been employed, at least for now, to have influence or to affect decision making at the national level. As I'm saying again, I'm not aware of those that are directly involved with technology development and so on and so forth. But at least as far as the national level is concerned, and at least the AU and all those, these are some of the interventions that are happening. They're very few, they're very, very minimal. Of course, more can be done. And one person that was very instrumental, unfortunately she's passed, is Wangari Maathai. She was very recognized for the role she played in environmental conservation in Kenya. And what she did was to mobilize the local women, for example, to embark on actual actions that will help conserve environment, conserve forestry resources. And so they went about planting so many trees. She's credited for having about 7.4 million trees planted in Kenya. And some of her activities actually gave her the opportunity to be the first Black woman to win a Nobel Prize, right? And her strategies were usually with the local people. So that is very, very important. It's not about women in the elite group on the boards in government agencies. No, because there you don't get much. The information comes from the bottom, and that is where it should start, bottom up, where the actual people on the ground, the actual people with the experiences contribute their knowledge, contribute their experiences to solving the problems that are faced to make things better. So these are the few that I'm aware of. Maybe hopefully there are more, hopefully, but these are the few that I'm aware of.
Yeah. And this is exactly actually the work that two works that we do. One is with the Feminist AI Research Network, which is about creating proof of concept, pro-social AI that works from community needs-based approach. So a community, we don't work with anybody unless they come to us with the community, and a technical group and a social scientist group together in a multidisciplinary approach, as Constanza has pointed to talk about what it is that community needs, and then to look through a whole sort of rigorous paper prototype pilot process that we have to build something that works for the community. And there's some interesting work that's been done by on behalf of this FAIR network by Técnicas Rudas with the Yaqui, also on the edge of your vast Amazon River, talking about water management and how would an indigenous community deal with water resource management, beginning with storytelling, beginning with their relationship with the water, and then also geospatial data. I mean, how do we combine all of these things together to kind of also flatten the hierarchy of knowledge, right? So it's not like the geospatial data being in the sky is higher in the heavens than what's on the ground, and what comes from the river, what comes from the earth, and what comes from this thousands of years of knowledge that's been passed down. And I do think that that's the work that we all have to do collectively now, and to learn from the little bits and pieces as we just sort of incrementally go forward, is how do we create these environments so that people can express what their needs are, and then make them into technology, because the technology is going to help if it's created in the right way. We do have a question actually about how examples of technology directly harming women across the 3 continents, but I see that I know that we're going to wrap up, so I would rather love to open it up as actually helping. This, we can open up the question as harms. We can open it up to a vision of a technology that could help, or a vision of really how you would like to see everything happen going forward. And maybe we'll do an opposite around the world. We'll start with Mensah, go to Neth, and then end with Constanza. So, Modestha.
So me first.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So those ones that generally directly harm, and then I'll talk about the positives. It's not all bad. At least there are some positives. Directly harm women in Africa are largely technologies that involve digitalization, technologies that involve industrial agriculture. Because what happens is that in these technologies, you need more minerals, raw materials for the material infrastructure of these technologies. Digitalization, for example, when we talk about digitalization, people hardly don't even think about the kind of material infrastructure that is the massive material infrastructure that is required, from data centers to cooling systems to energy. It's massive, and you need minerals for these. And also in an age where we are transitioning from fossil fuel to renewable energy, there's even greater need for raw rare earth minerals, right, to power these plants. You spoke about solar panels, wind panels. So you need minerals for these. So technologies in industrial agriculture, in digitalization, of course, AI being part of it, really affect women, because the displacement is high, loss of livelihood is high, health risk, security, and all that. It is also a bit helpful, at least in this context, is a bit the impact, the positive impact is really minimal. It's there, but it's really minimal. So we're hearing, for example, these drones that are being employed on agricultural plantations and other agricultural activities. But of course, well, even in that sense, and to increase production, even in that sense, it's hardly these women who are in charge. That's the truth. They're not in charge of procurement. They're not in charge of actual use. They're not in charge of the benefit. They're not. But well, at least if production is high, remuneration for work done will increase, and that somehow is a benefit. So what other positive? Honestly, I'm sorry, but from where
How
I'm
about
coming
the
from,
vision? We can
it's more negative. It's more negative
You
than
don't have to force it.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, if you think of a vision of how, because I think it's also so hard for us in a weird way, as a colleague said recently, that they've colonized our future as well, right? So we need to also be able to think about our future, what is free and being, what's the world that we want to create, which becomes sort of very difficult, especially when we look at, sort of the P doom vision of what's happening. But how about Neff? Let's go to Neff next.
Yeah. Thank you, Modestha, for starting it that way. I could have been as empathic, no, but thank you. Anyway, I echo everything that Modestha said, but I will give very concrete examples in Southeast Asia on how the environmental cost of digitalization and AI in particular could be detrimental to women, in particular in food and agriculture. I will cite the case of Taiwan. In 2022, Taiwan experienced its worst drought in centuries. And that was the time when car companies had to slow down in selling their cars. And the main reason for that is the computers in the cars could not work because of the problems in production of microchips. And the microchips production was affected by the drought in Taiwan. So people may be asking why? What's the link between water and microchips? As Modestha was talking about data centers, you also have to talk about the roots, the brain cells of the computer. Microchips are actually water guzzlers. They need ultra pure water to produce. And ultra pure water is like 1,000 times cleaner than mineral water that we drink. That's energy guzzler and that's water guzzler. In the case of Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, because TSMCI, the Taiwan Semiconductor Incorporated, is the world's biggest producer of microchips. I think about 90% of consumer microchips are produced by TSMCI. What the government of Taiwan did was to ration water. And in the process of rationing water, they actually cut off irrigation for 82,000 hectares of agricultural lands in order to prioritize the water needs of TSMCI. That's recorded. You can even Google it and you'll find tons of news articles about it. We've spoken to farmers in Taiwan. In January, they said that, yes, they had to stop production and the government paid them. They were actually compensated for stopping production because there's no water. So you could just imagine who's the most affected. Women, of course, who constitute, in the case of Taiwan, about 55% of labor, who carry most of the burden and who had to produce food. No? You have to buy food now because you cannot produce it. That's one concrete example. Second concrete example, less high-tech, is the introduction of combine harvesters in the Philippines. Combine harvesters are those huge tractors that do threshing, harvesting and threshing in rice areas. When the government deployed combine machines, 10 years ago, the first to be impacted are actually women laborers in the farm. Because they are the most dispensable, so they're the first to go. The jobs that were eaten up by the combine harvesters, which also do threshing, the first to go are women. And of course, those women, poor women, rural women who don't own land. Part of the reason why threshing of rice, I don't know if you are familiar with how rice is harvested and threshed. It's separated from the panicle and all that. In the old conventional technology of threshing, there's a lot of waste, quote unquote. Like grains that are actually thrown out of the threshing machine. You may look at that as waste, and FAO will probably register that as post-harvest losses. In reality, if you go on the ground, poor families, especially women, pick up those grains from the soil. And like I've spoken to women in marginalized communities who do this during threshing time. They said that they could actually gather as much as like not one sack, but probably half a sack of those coming from picking up from the ground, and that actually provides food for like 1-2 months for the family. But since these combine harvesters are so efficient, there's no grain, very little grain actually go on the ground, are wasted. So these women, poor families, don't have grains to rely on anymore. They have to buy that. So that's the negative effect. It may be positive in terms of production, but that's negative for those who are left behind. They're actually left behind even more. So I could cite more. So I would be glad to discuss this with Modestha. We could actually compile negative impacts of these technologies on women
We should
in Africa and Southeast Asia.
Sure, definitely.
and the unintended consequences of technological quote unquote advancement. Well,
Kaitlyn, I think it's good to pinpoint that it's not. I don't think it's accurate to say it's unintended, because they are invisible in the first place.
Right.
Nobody cares about these poor women who pick up grains on the ground, because that's inefficient. That's counter to the whole efficiency theory in production, right? So I think that has to be challenged as well.
Totally agree. And I've got to say too, in terms of framing, we've been trying to change this notion of not efficient, but to effective technology. So it's effective if it serves people, if it comes from people, if it meets their needs, right? So I'm sort of anti-efficiency in that way and all for effectiveness, which brings us to Constanza, who actually brought some of these issues up in the opening. So.
For sure. So just to add a few notes on what Modestha and Nat said on the impact of, of AI and other technologies on the environment. So I'm very proud to say that UNESCO's AI ethical recommendation, that is a global standard setting document signed by 193 countries. I think that's the last number. Done some years ago, which I was proudly part of the drafting committee for this. It was the first instrument of this kind that included a chapter on AI and the environment, and actually included a chapter on AI and gender, because, as parentheses normally, and, Caitlin is part of this effort, gender is sometimes, put in the data section of an ethical recommendation because, to have more inclusive data, but gender is so much more. And, we would have another conference just talking about the importance of making these policies, gender policies, transversal. And on the environment part, as Modestha said, it's not only about energy. We're talking about critical minerals, we're talking about water, we're talking about the inclusion of, frontline nature stewards in the decision making, in the entire life cycles AI systems and in the ecosystem in general. So one, we already have a document, and the question and the core that what needs to happen is how do we transform this, what is a guide, into operation? How do we enable the correct mechanisms for the countries through the leadership of both the government and industry to operationalize these principles, these values, this mindset of being very mindful of the impact of AI in the ecosystem? And that is serving as a guide. And actually, we as C-Minds are already working with UNESCO and other actors to explore how best to make this tangible. So that is on one end. The second point is, Nat talk about, leaving no one behind. So this is a very important question as well regarding finance. So when we're talking about leaving no one behind, we have to talk about, who is having access to finance. And I'm just gonna, pinpoint two facts. The first one is the indigenous people, they're nature stewards. They've done this historically. If we should learn from someone how to take care and how to balance, different, the well-being of communities and nature, which thrive in harmony, we should be learning at the very local level, these indigenous leaderships. However, from international financing on this, they only receive 1% of global finance. So the question is, why isn't, finance trickling down to nature stewards, And if we talk about women as well, actually, as part of this Fund Her working group that we're having with the global UNESCO team on Women for Ethical AI, we're also asking the question of why isn't finance going into the hands of female founders, of companies, of ventures, because it's not only about having new mechanisms of finance and creative mechanisms of finance and using technology to decentralize, finance and, using blockchain for traceability. There's a more deeper question on who is getting the finance and for what. Because if we don't kind of redefine the for what, then we believe that it's just multiplying again old narratives. It is multiplying, the old way of seeing an economy based on extraction and not regeneration. So asking who is getting the money at the local level, and is it women who are accessing these new forms of financing mechanisms, should be core together with purpose. And the third point, on a very positive note, because we tend to go always on the negative, but I'm very proud to say that, we launched a prize, in Latin America and the Caribbean for different people and from, all type of sectors and all type of communities to apply for funding and support with ideas and solutions that leveraged emerging technologies together with local knowledge and traditional knowledge and wisdom. And we got in a few weeks, more than 200 very solid ideas of using both creativity, technological potential, and the potential of collective action to change the reality bottom up and to create new forms of, a market driven by nature conservation and redefine what collaboration means, going from the very local to the very global, and redefine new paradigms that are more in harmony with people and nature. And I'm very proud and very humbled at that sense that in very few days, we got more than 200 very concrete ideas. And I believe that this is a metaphor of the generation we are living in today, where we are learning how to, leverage these new tools and create different realities from the global South, especially, and from new voices that come from territory.
That's a fabulous and a positive and energetic note for us all to go off and just to embrace new voices and to amplify our own voices and their voices in order to sort of to change this entire paradigm, because this is really about a paradigm shift more than anything else. So I want to thank you so much again to Modestha Daño, dialing in from the Philippines late this evening, Modestha Mensah dialing in from Ghana in the late afternoon, and Constanza Gómez Mont dialing in early in the morning from her perch. And I think that you are in Mexico today. I don't know where you are. Everybody travels so much. It's very hard to identify the country of the day. But I thank you so much, colleagues, for joining us in this conversation, which I know is going to continue. So our heartfelt thanks from the AI equality community. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Nice meeting you,
It was really
Constanza.
nice to meet you, Elenita.
I
I think we should communicate more about the similarities.
We will.